framing issues in such a way that people can see more deeply, not just into the future, but into the present, and how the present is shaping the future. And I want to talk today about the extraordinary convergence of computing and human potential that literally is taking us towards a kind of global brain. Now, this is actually something that Kevin Kelly has talked about for many, many years, and perhaps during the Q&A later we'll be able to get to that. I'm going to start, though, in a somewhat unexpected place, talking about the Google autonomous vehicle, which hardly looks like an example of this global brain or collective action at work, and yet it is. Because you see, in 2005, when the US DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, put out their grand challenge for autonomous vehicles, the winner went 7 miles in 7 hours. Yet only 6 years later, Google announced that they had a car that had gone hundreds of thousands of miles in ordinary traffic. What was the difference? Was it better artificial intelligence algorithms? John McCarthy, the computer pioneer, said the science and engineering of making intelligent machines was his definition of AI. And so when IBM's Watson computer beat human champions at Jeopardy, this looks like a triumph of artificial intelligence. And so too does that Google autonomous vehicle. But there's a secret here. Peter Norvig, the chief scientist at Google, said, we don't have better algorithms, we just have more data. And the really important thing is, what is that data and where did it come from? And it turns out that it was the Google Street View vehicles that were gathering that data. Now, if you've ever seen Google Street View, you know that it's a way that you can see the buildings and the landscape features along your route because Google photographed the roads with a car looking like this. But that car was also making very, very precise measurements of location. They literally have laser interferometry where they're measuring the distance to the buildings shown in those pictures within an accuracy of millimeters. And so the Google autonomous vehicle is actually remembering that data. And that data came from humans driving those Street View cars. So anytime that automated vehicle is going on this seemingly magical route, it's doing it with the memory of augmented humans augmented by sensors. And as Peter said to me, it's very hard to pick out of a field of view of a camera, say, a traffic light. But it's very easy using AI to pick out whether it's red or green if you already know that it's there. So this is surprisingly an example of what JCR Licklider, who was a legendary DARPA program manager who funded TCP/IP, the foundation protocol of the internet, wrote in a paper in 1960 called Man-Computer Symbiosis. He said, the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. Now, back in 1960, Licklider was not thinking about the kinds of things that we're doing today, but he clearly had the right idea. I've used the term harnessing collective intelligence as the key characteristic of modern applications. You know, applications like Google or Facebook or Twitter are ways of bringing our minds together. And so too, surprisingly, is this Google autonomous vehicle. So here is what my argument is, that we are building a network-mediated global mind. Now, it's not the Skynet of the Terminator science fiction movies. It's us augmented by sensors and by computers. And I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about some of those kinds of augmentation. But let me first go to a humble example that was first proposed by computer scientist Danny Hillis in a conversation with Jeff Bezos, who then recounted it to our Emerging Technologies Conference in 2005. He said, global consciousness is that thing responsible for deciding that pots containing decaffeinated coffee should be orange. Now, I don't know if that's true here in Korea, but in many parts of the world, there's a company called Sanka, which was the pioneer in decaffeinated coffee. Their brand color was orange, and it became a kind of universal symbol on coffee pots to represent decaffeinated. So somehow this idea, this meme, spread from mind to mind and went beyond the brand to become a relatively universal symbol. Now, this is exactly what's happening at much, much higher speed with Twitter. So, for example, a new meme like Occupy Wall Street, the hashtag OWS, sprang up last year and suddenly was known by millions, tens of millions, perhaps even hundreds of millions of people. This has always been the case, of course, with media, back from the first medium, spoken language, through written language, through the book, through television, radio, and all forms of media are really about spreading knowledge from mind to mind. But it's increasingly real time. In fact, Kevin Kelly told me a remarkable anecdote this morning. He met a woman in the audience who is unable to hear. And because there's no assistive technology here, no captioning, no interpreter, he said, "How are you following the talk?" And he said, "Well," she said, "I'm looking at the slides and I'm following the Twitter stream." So here is technology being used to augment a human, and our collective intelligence helping to shape the experience of a single person. Of course, this technology can also be used to organize people. Here is a copy of the Facebook page that by some accounts played an important role in triggering the Egyptian revolution. These technologies for sharing, collaboration are computer mediated, but they have humans at the heart of them. But it doesn't have to be complex technology. Take Wikipedia. Wikis are very simple. You remember when there was the great earthquake in Japan last year. This is the first Wikipedia page, a few bare facts. Yet over a period of months, here's an animation of how that page was augmented by thousands of volunteers bringing in thousands of facts through thousands of updates to make a full-featured account of the disaster. So that's collective intelligence at work, mediated by the internet, but also by a simple kind of technology, the wiki. Michael Nielsen, in his book Reinventing Discovery, which is about the application of networks and social technology to science, wrote, "Wikipedia is not an encyclopedia, it is a virtual city. A city whose main export to the world is its encyclopedia articles, but with an internal life of its own." I highly recommend this book if you want to understand how these principles from social media and the consumer internet are applying to other areas of our society. There's another aspect to this story of man-machine symbiosis that I want to return to. In one of the other seminal documents of the early computer industry, Vannevar Bush wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine in 1945 called As We May Think. And he talked about the notion of how computers would augment humans' ability to retrieve information. And he said, one cannot hope to equal the speed and flexibility with which the mind follows an associative trail, but it should be possible to beat the mind decisively in regard to the permanence and clarity of the items resurrected from storage. Now, of course, that's exactly what we saw with the Google autonomous vehicle. But it's also what we see in so many of our smartphone apps. That device knows where we are, has new senses that we didn't have, the GPS. You know, I could be dropped anywhere in Seoul, and I can find my way around. This is really just the beginning of something really profound. We're going much further in this direction. This is actually a point about information retrieval. In healthcare, IBM Watson is now being used to become an assistant to the doctor. Most physicians have about 5 hours a month to read up on the latest medical literature. Yet Watson can read 200 million pages in the 3 seconds that it took to come up with a Jeopardy answer. And IBM is turning this to healthcare. Now, those documents were provided by humans. So once again, this is showing us that we're building a man-machine symbiosis. When Watson becomes an assistant to a doctor saying, have you thought about this procedure? It's because the computer can read far more documents far more quickly and come up with possible answers. It's a guide. It's not actually doing the diagnosis, but it's suggesting things that the doctor might want to consider. But probably the most striking use of collective intelligence to bring people together using sensors and smartphones, maybe the disaster response to the Haiti earthquake. There was a group put together that used, called Crisis Commons, that used a variety of technologies to deal with the earthquake. There's a technology called Ushahidi, which uses smartphones or texting to report information in a collaborative, crowdsourced way. But of course, in Haiti, with the earthquake, they didn't have maps to be able to report the locations. So the OpenStreetMap team got together and actually mapped the slums in as close to real time as possible so that people could report where people were trapped in the rubble. But it didn't end there. The reports were in Haitian Creole, but the rescuers didn't actually speak Creole. So this was sent out via sites like Crowdflower and Sahana to be translated in real time by members of the Haitian expat community, and then you could guide rescuers to the location with messages in their language. But this technology of collective intelligence isn't always used for good. We see disturbing stories about how our financial industry, which is using, in many ways, collective intelligence to draw on the market, becomes manipulative and starts using collective intelligence to trade against us as a people. There's an article in Foreign Policy, how Goldman Sachs created a food crisis by speculating on food commodity prices. This is the global brain used for ill. So that leads me to my concluding question. As we think about the future of this technology of man-machine symbiosis, this passage towards a global brain, we have to ask ourselves how we can make the emerging global consciousness not only smarter and more capable, but also more moral. Because you see, we've only got one world, and if we become collectively the global brain of that world, we have got to get it right. We have got to have that brain be smart, able to tackle the big problems that the world faces, but also to know and care and to work on stuff that matters. Thank you very much.